The term Reconstruction Era, in the context of the history of the United States, has two senses. The first covers the complete history of the entire country from 1865 to 1877 following the Civil War. The second sense focuses on the transformation of the southern United States from 1863 to 1877, as directed by Congress, with the reconstruction of state and society. From 1863 to 1865, Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson both took moderate positions designed to bring the South back to normal as quickly as possible, while the radical Republicans used Congress to block any moderate approaches, impose harsh terms, and upgrade the rights of the freedmen. Johnson followed a lenient policy toward ex-Confederates much like Lincoln's. Lincoln's last speeches show that he was leaning towards supporting the enfranchisement of all freedmen, whereas Johnson was opposed to this. Johnson's interpretations of Lincoln's policies prevailed until the congressional elections of 1866 in the North, which enabled the radicals to take control of policy, remove former Confederates from power, and enfranchise the freedmen. A Republican coalition came to power in nearly all the southern states and set out to transform the society by setting up a free labor economy, using the U.S. Army and the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau protected the legal rights of freedmen, negotiated labor contracts, and set up schools and even churches for them. Thousands of Northerners came south as missionaries, teachers, businessmen, and politicians. Hostile elements called them carpetbaggers. Rebuilding the run-down railroad system was a major strategy, but it collapsed when a nationwide depression struck the economy. The radicals, frustrated by Johnson's opposition to congressional reconstruction, filed impeachment charges, but the action failed by one vote in the Senate. In early 1866, Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau and Civil Rights bills and sent them to Johnson for his signature. The first bill extended the life of the Bureau, originally established as a temporary organization charged with assisting refugees and freed slaves, while the second defined all persons born in the United States as national citizens who were to enjoy equality before the law. After Johnson vetoed the bills, causing a permanent rupture in his relationship with Congress that would culminate in his impeachment in 1868, the Civil Rights Act became the first major bill to become law over presidential veto. President Ulysses S. Grant supported radical Reconstruction and enforced the protection of African Americans in the South through the use of the enforcement acts passed by Congress. Grant suppressed the Ku Klux Klan, but was unable to resolve the escalating tensions inside the Republican Party between the carpetbaggers and the scalawags. Meanwhile, self-styled conservatives strongly opposed Republican rule. They alleged widespread corruption by the carpetbaggers, excessive state spending and ruinous taxes. The opposition violently counterattacked and regained power in each redeemed southern state by 1877. Meanwhile, public support for Reconstruction policies faded in the North as voters decided the Civil War was over and slavery was dead. The Democrats, who strongly opposed Reconstruction, regained control of the House of Representatives in 1874. The presidential electoral vote in 1876 was very close and confused, forcing Congress to make the final decision. The deployment of the U.S. Army was central to the survival of Republican state governments. They collapsed when the Army was removed in 1877 as part of a congressional bargain to elect Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president. Reconstruction was a significant chapter in the history of civil rights in the United States, but most historians consider it a failure. After Reconstruction ended, the South was left to poverty. poverty-stricken backwater dependent on agriculture, while white Southerners soon succeeded in re-establishing legal and political dominance over blacks through violence, intimidation and discrimination. Historian Eric Fone argues, what remains certain is that Reconstruction failed, and that for blacks its failure was a disaster whose magnitude cannot be obscured by the genuine accomplishments that did endure. Dating the Reconstruction era. In the different states Reconstruction began and ended at different times. Federal Reconstruction finally ended with the Compromise of 1877. In recent decades most historians follow Fone in dating the Reconstruction of the South as starting in 1863 rather than 1865. The usual ending has always been 1877. Reconstruction policies were debated in the North when the war began, and commenced in earnest after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863. Overview. As Confederate states came back under control of the U.S. Army, President Abraham Lincoln set up reconstructed governments in Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana during the war. He experimented by giving land to former slaves in South Carolina. By fall 1865, the new President Andrew Johnson declared the war goals of national unity and the ending of slavery achieved and Reconstruction completed. Republicans in Congress, refusing to accept Johnson's terms, rejected new members of Congress, some of whom had been high Confederate officials a few months before. Johnson broke with the Republicans after vetoing two key bills that supported the Freedmen's Bureau and provided federal civil rights to the freedmen. The 1866 congressional elections turned on the issue of Reconstruction, producing a sweeping Republican victory in the North, and providing the radical Republicans with sufficient control of Congress to override Johnson's vetoes and commence their own radical Reconstruction in 1867. The same year, Congress removed civilian governments in the South, and placed the former Confederacy under the rule of the U.S. Army. The Army conducted new elections in which the freed slaves could vote, while whites who had held leading positions under the Confederacy were temporarily denied the vote and were not permitted to run for office. In 10 states, coalitions of freedmen, recent black and white arrivals from the North, and white Southerners who supported Reconstruction cooperated to form Republican biracial state governments. They introduced various Reconstruction programs including funding public schools, establishing charitable institutions, raising taxes, and offering massive aid to support improved railroad transportation and shipping. Conservative opponents called the Republican regimes corrupt and instigated violence toward freedmen and whites who supported Reconstruction. Much of the violence was carried out by members of the Ku Klux Klan, a secret terrorist organization. This led to federal intervention by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1871 that suppressed the Klan. White Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, regained control state by state, sometimes using fraud and violence to control state elections. A deep national economic depression following the Panic of 1873 led to major Democratic gains in the North, the collapse of many railroad schemes in the South, and a growing sense of frustration in the North. The end of Reconstruction was a staggered process, and a period of Republican control ended at different times in different states. With the Compromise of 1877, Army intervention in the Southeast and Republican control collapsed in the last 3 state governments in the South. This was followed by a period that white Southerners labeled Redemption, during which white-dominated state legislatures enacted Jim Crow laws laws and, beginning in 1890, disenfranchised most blacks and many poor whites through a combination of constitutional amendments and electoral laws. The white Democratic Southerners' memory of Reconstruction played a major role in imposing the system of white supremacy and second-class citizenship for blacks, known as the Age of Jim Crow. Purpose: Reconstruction addressed how the 11 seceding states would regain what the Constitution calls a republican form of government and be reseated in Congress. The civil status of the former leaders of the Confederacy, and the constitutional and legal status of freedmen, especially the civil rights and whether they should be given the right to vote. Intense controversy erupted throughout the South over these issues. The laws and constitutional amendments that laid the foundation for the most radical phase of Reconstruction were adopted from 1866 to 1871. By the 1870s, Reconstruction had officially provided freedmen with equal rights under the Constitution, and blacks were voting and taking political office. Republican legislatures, coalitions of whites and blacks, established the first public school systems and numerous charitable institutions in the South. White paramilitary organizations, especially the Ku Klux Klan and also the White League and Red Shirts, formed with the political aim of driving out the Republicans. They also disrupted political organizing and terrorized blacks to bar them from the polls. President Grant used federal power to effectively shut down the KKK in the early 1870s, though the other, smaller groups continued to operate. From 1873 to 1877, conservative whites regained power in the southern states. They joined the Bourbon wing of the National Democratic Party. In the 1860s and 1870s, the terms radical and conservative had distinctive meanings. Conservative was the name of a faction, often led by the planter class. Leaders who had been Whigs were committed to economic modernization, built around railroads, factories, banks, and cities. Most of the radical Republicans in the North were men who believed in free enterprise and industrialization. Most were also modernizers and former Whigs. The liberal Republicans of 1872 shared the same outlook, except they were especially opposed to the corruption they saw around President Grant, and believed that the goals of the Civil War had been achieved so that the federal military intervention could now end. Passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments is the constitutional legacy of Reconstruction. These Reconstruction amendments established the rights that led to Supreme Court rulings in the mid-20th century that struck down school segregation. A second Reconstruction, sparked by the Civil Rights Movement, led to civil rights laws in 1964 and 1965 that ended segregation and opened the polls to blacks. Material devastation of the South in 1865. Reconstruction played out against an economy in ruin. The Confederacy in 1861 had 297 towns and cities with a total population of 835,000 people. Of these, 162 with 681,000 people were at one point occupied by Union forces. 11 were destroyed or severely damaged by war action, including Atlanta, Charleston, Columbia, and Richmond. The 11 contained 115,900 people in the 1860 census, or 14% of the urban South. The number of people who lived in the destroyed towns represented just over 1% of the Confederacy's combined urban and rural populations. The rate of damage in smaller towns was much lower. Only 45 courthouses were burned out of a total of 830. Farms were in disrepair, and the pre-war stock of horses, mules and cattle was much depleted. 2/5 or 40% of the South's livestock had been killed. The South's farms were not highly mechanized, but the value of farm implements and machinery in the 1860 census was $81 million and was reduced by 2/5 or 40% by 1870. The transportation infrastructure lay in ruins, with little railroad or riverboat service available to move crops and animals to market. Railroad mileage was located mostly in rural areas, and over two-thirds of the South's rails, bridges, rail yards, repair shops and rolling stock were in areas reached by Union armies, which systematically destroyed what they could. Even in untouched areas, the lack of maintenance and repair, the absence of new equipment, the heavy overuse, and the deliberate relocation of equipment by the Confederates from remote areas to the war zone ensured the system would be ruined at war's end. Restoring the infrastructure, especially the railroad system, became a high priority for Reconstruction state governments. The enormous cost of the Confederate war effort took a high toll on the South's economic infrastructure. The direct costs to the Confederacy in human capital, government expenditures, and physical destruction from the war totaled $3.3 billion. By 1865, the Confederate dollar was worthless due to higher inflation, and people in the South had to resort to bartering services for goods, or else use scarce Union dollars. With the emancipation of the Southern slaves, the entire economy of the South had to be rebuilt. Having lost their enormous investment in slaves, white planters had minimal capital to pay freedmen workers to bring in crops. As a result, a system of sharecropping was developed where landowners broke up large plantations and rented small lots to the freedmen and the families. The South was transformed from an elite minority of landed gentry slaveholders into a tenant farming agriculture system. The end of the Civil War was accompanied by a large migration of new freed people to the cities. In the cities, African Americans were relegated to the lowest paying jobs such as unskilled and service labor. Men worked as rail workers, rolling and lumber mills workers, and hotel workers. A large population of slave artisans during the antebellum period had not been translated into a large number of freeman artisans during Reconstruction. Black women were largely confined to domestic work, employed as cooks, maids, and child nurses. Others worked in hotels. A large number became laundresses. The dislocations had severe negative impact on the black population, with a large amount of sickness and death. Over a quarter of Southern white men of military age, the backbone of the South's wide workforce, died during the war, leaving countless families destitute. Per capita income for white Southerners declined from $125 in 1857 to a low of $80 in 1879. By the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the South was locked into a system of poverty. How much of this failure was caused by the war and by previous reliance on agriculture remains the subject of debate among economists and historians.